I need to get this out because I've been sitting on this anger for so long that it's become part of my DNA at this point. And last Thursday, everything finally came to a head in a way that's going to change my entire family forever. This is going to be long because there's a lot of backstory that matters here, so if you're still reading after the first few paragraphs, buckle up because this gets intense. Thanksgiving 2024. I'm 30 years old, standing in my parents' kitchen, carving the turkey like I've done every year since I was tall enough to reach the counter safely. The knife was going through the breast meat in clean strokes, and I was actually doing a decent job of it when I heard them in the dining room. They thought I couldn't hear them over the sound of the electric knife. Or maybe they just didn't care anymore. My dad Clayton started it off like he always does. That jovial tone he uses when he's about to say something cruel, but I wants it to sound like a joke. Can't believe this loser shares my DNA, he said loud enough that I could hear every word. 30 years old, still single, still broke. My Aunt Brianna jumped right in because she never misses a chance to pile on. At least the failure can cut meat, she said, with this sneering laugh. That's about all he's good for. My brother Blake added his bit about how I used to think I'd be somebody. Remember that, he said to the room. Like they were all sharing this hilarious memory. Now he's just the family charity case. Mom Lois sighed, in that way she does when she wants everyone to know she's suffering. I keep his photo hidden, she said. Too embarrassing to explain to friends. My sister Lily giggled and said even the turkey has more value than him. Grandpa Elliot muttered something about me should have been aborted, and they all roared with laughter. Someone suggested making me wash the dishes, too, called it minimum wage practice. I kept carving, kept my face blank. Smiled even because I'd been waiting for this moment for 3 years and they'd just given me exactly what I needed. See, that's the thing nobody tells you about being the family scapegoat for your entire adult life. Eventually, you stop trying to prove them wrong, and you start planning something else entirely. Let me back up because you need to understand how we got here. I'm the youngest of 3 kids in a family that's always been weirdly obsessed with appearances and success markers. Blake is the golden child, 35 years old, works in sales at his buddy's car dealership and acts like he's running a Fortune 500 company. Lily is 32, married to some guy named Jackson who works in insurance. They have 2 kids and a house in the suburbs that my parents never shut up about. Then there's me. I made the mistake of dropping out of college when I was 21. I was studying business administration at a state school and I hated every second of it. Felt like I was suffocating under the weight of expectations that had nothing to do with who I actually was or what I wanted. I left school and spent 2 years working at a warehouse. Then, a year at a retail store, just trying to figure out what I actually wanted to do with my life instead of what everyone expected me to do. My family never forgave me for that. In their eyes, I went from being a disappointment to being a complete failure, and they've treated me like one ever since. The thing is, I eventually figured it out. When I was 24, I started learning IT certification programs on my own. Spent every spare dollar on courses and testing fees. Got my CompTIA A+ first, then Network Plus, then Security Plus. By the time I was 26, I was working help desk at a mid-sized company making decent money. At 27, I moved into network administration. Now, at 30, I'm a senior systems administrator making $85,000 a year with benefits, working remotely from my own apartment that I rent in a city 2 hours away from my hometown. But here's the crucial part that connects to everything that happened at Thanksgiving. My family doesn't know any of this. As far as they know, I'm still working retail and barely scraping by. I never corrected them because about 3 years ago, I realized something important. They needed me to be the failure. They needed someone to look down on, someone to make themselves feel better about their own mediocre lives. Blake's car sales job that barely keeps him afloat with commission checks. Lily's marriage that I'm pretty sure is held together by inertia and her fear of being alone. My parents' retirement that's way less comfortable than they pretend it is. 3 years ago at Thanksgiving 2021, I overheard a similar conversation to this year's. Different words, but same message. You know the drill. That was when I stopped trying to have a relationship with them and started planning something else. I kept showing up to family events because I needed to observe them. Needed to understand exactly how their family dynamic worked and where the pressure points were. I stayed quiet, let them mock me, played into their expectations. Every family dinner where they made comments, every holiday where they treated me like the hired help, I was gathering information and waiting. The warehouse where I used to work, I left on good terms with the manager, a guy who appreciated that I showed up on time and did the work. We stayed in touch. About 8 months ago, he told me the company was expanding and they needed someone to overhaul their entire IT infrastructure. Small company, about 50 employees, but growing fast. They needed someone to set up servers, manage their network, implement security protocols, the whole deal. He asked if I knew anyone who could do it. I said I could do it myself. Project-based work, nights and weekends, good money. I spent 6 months on that project and made an extra $30,000 while working my regular job during the day. That money went straight into savings because I knew I'd need it. Not for anything illegal, not for anything sketchy, just for leverage when the time came. Because I knew my family well enough to know they'd eventually need something from me. And when they did, I wanted to be in the strongest possible position to say no, or to name my terms, or to make them understand exactly how badly they'd screwed up by treating me like garbage for 9 solid years. So Thanksgiving, 2024, I'm standing there carving turkey while they mock me. And I'm thinking about how Blake mentioned last month that he might need to borrow money from Dad because his commission checks have been light. I'm thinking about how Lily complained on Facebook about Jackson's hours getting cut at the insurance company. I'm thinking about how Mom mentioned their property taxes going up and how they might need to make some adjustments to their budget. I'm thinking about how Grandpa Elliot has been having health issues and how expensive his medications are getting. I'm thinking about how I've spent 3 years watching them build this perfect little family unit where I'm the outsider, the failure, the one who doesn't matter. And I'm thinking about how fragile that whole structure actually is, how much it relies on everyone playing their part and nobody rocking the boat. I brought the turkey platter into the dining room and set it on the table. They all went quiet when I walked in, that sudden silence that happens when people realize they might have been overheard. I looked at each of them, made eye contact, smiled. Clayton cleared his throat and said something about how nice the turkey looked. Brianna complimented my carving skills in this overly sweet tone that made it clear she was mocking me even now. Blake asked if I'd remembered to save the wishbone like I always do. I sat down at my usual spot at the far end of the table, the seat that's technically part of the family gathering, but might as well be in another room for how much they included me in conversations. I ate my meal while they talked around me about Blake's sales numbers and Lily's kids' school activities and Mom's garden club drama. Normal family stuff that I wasn't part of. I'd been mentally checked out of this family for 3 years, but this was different. This was the last time I'd sit at this table and pretend any of this was okay. After dinner, they did make me wash the dishes. Not directly, they never actually ordered me around, but Lois mentioned how tired she was and how nice it would be if someone helped clean up, and everyone looked at me with these expectant faces. Blake and Lily disappeared into the living room with their families. Clayton and Elliot settled in to watch football. Brianna left to go meet up with her friends. I stood at the sink washing plates and thinking about what comes next. I drove back to my apartment that night, 2 hours on empty highways because I'd learned years ago to never stay overnight at my parents' house during holidays. The whole drive I was running through everything in my head, checking my plans, making sure I hadn't missed anything. Because the thing about revenge, real revenge, is that it can't be impulsive. It can't be based on anger, even though anger is absolutely part of it. It has to be calculated and it has to hit every target precisely where they're vulnerable. When I got home, I opened my laptop and started going through my files. I had spreadsheets tracking every conversation where they'd mentioned financial concerns. I had saved screenshots of Facebook posts where they'd complained about money or asked for recommendations for cheaper services. I had notes from family gatherings where people had let slip information about their situations that they probably thought I wasn't paying attention to. 3 years of information gathering, all organized and ready to use. The next morning, Friday, I called my cousin Dana, who's Brianna's daughter. Dana and I have always gotten along okay. She's 26 and smart enough to see through the family dynamics even if she doesn't call it out directly. I asked her about Thanksgiving dinner, if everyone had a good time. She laughed and said it was the usual circus. Her mom had a few too many glasses of wine and got loud. Then she mentioned something interesting that I hadn't known before. She said Brianna had been asking her for money, said she had some unexpected expenses and needed help covering rent this month. That was new information. Brianna's always been the one with money to spare, always showing off her latest purchases and talking about her shopping trips. If she was having money problems, that changed the equation. I asked Dana a few more casual questions and found out that Brianna's boyfriend had recently moved out and stopped contributing to rent, and she was scrambling to cover the difference on her salon receptionist salary. I spent the weekend making phone calls and sending messages to various family members, not saying anything suspicious, just checking in like a concerned family member might. Asked Blake how work was going, commiserated when he said November had been slow for sales. Texted Lily to ask how Jackson was doing, got back a message about how stressful things have been with his reduced hours. Messaged my dad about how he and mom were holding up. Got a response about how retirement was more expensive than they'd planned for. Everyone was struggling more than they let on at family gatherings. Everyone was pretending to be doing better than they actually were. and everyone had gotten very comfortable with the family dynamic where I was the failure and they were the successful ones, which meant they'd stopped watching their backs when it came to me. Sunday night, I got a call from Blake. He asked if I had any money I could lend him, said he was in a tight spot and needed about $2,000 to cover some bills until his next commission check came through. The fact that he was asking me for money, after calling me a charity case 3 days ago, would have been funny if I wasn't so focused on what this meant for my plans. I told him I didn't have that kind of money to spare. He got quiet, then asked if I was sure. Said he really needed help and I was family. I said I was working retail and barely covering my own rent, which is what he'd been telling everyone I was doing for years. So surely he understood I couldn't help. He got frustrated and hung up without saying goodbye. That's when I knew. The cracks were already showing and I hadn't even started applying real pressure yet. They were vulnerable in ways they'd been hiding from each other and definitely hiding from me. And in their minds, I was still the broke failure who couldn't possibly be a threat to any of them. I'm writing this now because things are about to get very real, and I needed to get the backstory out there. I've been planning this for 3 years, and I'm finally in position to make them understand exactly what they've done. Some of you are probably thinking I should just cut them off and move on, and trust me, I've considered it. But that's not justice. That's just walking away from people who spent 9 years making me feel worthless. What I'm about to do isn't illegal, and it isn't going to hurt them physically, but it's going to hurt them where they've been hurting me for years. I'm going to make them face consequences for treating family like garbage, and I'm going to make sure they know exactly why it's happening. They wanted me to be the failure in their story. They're about to find out what happens when the failure stops playing along. Update 1. Okay, so the response to my last post was intense, and I appreciate everyone who commented telling me to cut them off and run. But you're missing the point here. I spent 9 years being their punching bag, and I'm not walking away without making them face what they did. Some of you got it, though. Shout out to the commenter who said I should let them drown in their own mess, because that's basically the plan. It's been 2 weeks since Thanksgiving, and things have escalated in ways I didn't fully anticipate, which honestly makes this even better, because it means they're more desperate than I realized. I'm going to walk you through everything that's happened because the family dynamics are imploding in real time, and I need to get this all documented while it's fresh. Monday after Thanksgiving, my mom called me. She doesn't usually call me directly. Normally, she just adds me to family group texts that I mostly ignore, so I knew something was up. She started with the usual small talk about how nice Thanksgiving was and how good the turkey turned out, like she hadn't been sitting at that table while everyone mocked me. Then she got to the real reason for the call. She said they were having some financial difficulties with the property taxes on the house and asked if I could help contribute something toward the bill since I lived there growing up. And it would be supporting the family home. This is where I started playing the game differently than they expected. Instead of just saying no like I did with Blake, I asked her exactly how much the property taxes were. She seemed surprised I was engaging with the question at all. She said they were $4,800 due by the end of December, and they were short about $2,000. I asked why they were short, and she got defensive. Said it was none of my business, but they'd had unexpected expenses, and retirement wasn't as comfortable as they'd hoped. I told her I'd think about it. She got quiet and then said she really needed to know soon because the deadline was approaching. I said I'd let her know by the end of the week. She tried to push for a commitment right then, but I just repeated that I needed time to think about it and hung up. The fact that I didn't immediately say I couldn't afford it seemed to throw her off. I could hear it in her response, that little pause where she was trying to figure out if she'd misunderstood my financial situation. Wednesday, Lily texted me asking if we could meet up. She lives about an hour from my apartment, so she suggested a restaurant halfway between us. I agreed, and we met Thursday evening at this chain place off the highway, the kind with oversized portions and neon signs. She showed up looking stressed, her hair pulled back in a messy bun and wearing sweatpants like she'd just given up on appearances entirely. We sat down and ordered food, and she spent the first 15 minutes complaining about her kids' school expenses and how Jackson's reduced hours at the insurance company were killing them financially. She said they were behind on the mortgage by 2 months, and the bank was sending threatening letters. She said she'd tried to borrow from mom and dad, but they told her they couldn't help right now because of their own money problems. She asked if Blake had any money he could lend them, and I said Blake had actually called me asking to borrow money, which seemed to shock her. She looked at me across the table and asked point blank if I had any money I could lend her. She said she knew I didn't make much working retail, but maybe I had something saved up, anything would help. I took a bite of my burger and told her I had about $35,000 in savings. She actually choked on her water. She asked me to repeat that. I said it again, 35,000 give or take. She wanted to know how the hell I had that kind of money working retail. So I told her. Not everything, but enough to make it clear that their entire understanding of my life was wrong. I told her I wasn't working retail anymore and hadn't been for years. I said I was a senior systems administrator making good money working remotely. I said I'd also done side projects that paid well. She sat there processing this information like I just told her I was secretly a millionaire or something. She asked why I never told anyone in the family. I said nobody ever asked, and they all seemed so sure about what my life was like that I saw no reason to correct them. She got defensive then, said we all assumed I was still struggling because I never talked about my job or my life. I pointed out that every time I tried to talk about anything, I got talked over or dismissed. So eventually, I stopped trying. She didn't have a response to that. She just sat there looking at her plate. Then she asked if I would lend her money. I said no. She asked why not if I had it. I said because 2 weeks ago she sat at Thanksgiving dinner while everyone mocked me and called me worthless and she laughed along with them, so no. I wasn't interested in helping her out of her mess. She got upset then, said that was just family teasing and I was being too sensitive. I asked her if she'd think it was just teasing if her kids heard adults saying she should have been aborted. She went pale. She tried to backtrack, said she didn't realize I'd heard all of that and it wasn't meant seriously. I told her I'd heard every word and they absolutely meant it. And the fact that she was trying to minimize it now just proved she knew it was wrong. She started crying and said she was desperate and needed help. I finished my burger and told her she should ask Blake for money since he's the successful one. Then I paid for my meal and left her sitting there. The drive back to my apartment, I was riding this weird high of vindication and rage mixed together. This was working better than I'd planned because they were all revealing themselves faster than I'd anticipated. They didn't just need money. They were desperate for it. And they'd built such a perfect facade of success that they couldn't even help each other without admitting they were all struggling. Friday morning, I got a group text from Dad in the family group chat asking everyone if we could do a family meeting this weekend to discuss some important matters. Blake immediately responded asking what it was about. Dad said we should discuss it in person. Lily agreed we should meet up. Brianna said she could make it Saturday afternoon. I didn't respond at all. Saturday afternoon, my phone started blowing up. Dad calling, Mom calling, Blake texting asking where I was. I waited until evening and then texted the group saying I'd been busy with work and hadn't seen the messages. Dad called immediately and asked if I could come by the house Sunday for the family meeting. I asked what it was about. He said they needed to discuss family finances and mutual support. I said I'd think about it. He got frustrated and said this was important and I needed to be there. I told him I'd let him know in the morning. Sunday morning, I drove to my parents' house. The whole family was already there when I arrived around noon. Blake and his wife in the living room, Lily and Jackson with their kids playing in the den, Brianna looking uncomfortable on the couch, Grandpa Elliot in his usual chair, and Mom and Dad standing in the kitchen doorway like they were about to make some big announcement. Everyone got quiet when I walked in. Dad started the meeting by saying times were tough for everyone, and they needed to discuss how the family could support each other. He said they'd always been a close family, and that meant helping each other out when needed. Blake jumped in and said he'd been having a rough month with sales and could use some temporary financial help. Lily said they were behind on their mortgage. Brianna admitted she was struggling with rent after her boyfriend moved out. Mom said she and Dad needed help with property taxes. Grandpa Elliot said his medication costs were getting out of control. Then they all looked at me. There was this moment of silence where I realized they'd coordinated this whole thing, called this meeting expecting me to be the solution to all their problems. Dad said he'd heard I was doing better financially than they'd realized, and maybe I could help the family out. I asked who told him that. Lily looked down at her lap. So she'd run straight to Mom and Dad after our dinner and told them I had money. I looked around the room at all of them, these people who'd spent years making me feel like nothing, and I asked why they thought I'd help any of them. Mom said because we're family and family helps family. I laughed at that. I actually laughed out loud and Blake told me to stop being immature. I asked him if he remembered Thanksgiving dinner. He said that was just joking around. I asked Brianna if calling me a failure was a joke. She said I was taking things too seriously. I asked Lily if saying the turkey had more value than me was funny. She said she was sorry if I got offended. None of them would admit what they'd actually done. They all minimized it, called it teasing or joking, said I was being too sensitive. Grandpa Elliot told me to man up and help my family instead of holding grudges. That's when I told them exactly how much money I made, what my job actually was, what I'd been doing for the past 6 years while they all assumed I was a failure. Mom looked genuinely shocked. Dad tried to recover by saying he was proud of me for turning things around. Blake said he'd always known I had potential. I told them they could all handle their own financial problems because I wasn't giving them a single dollar. Mom said I was being selfish and cruel. I said I learned from the best. Lily's kids started crying because the adults were yelling, and Lily told me I was upsetting her children. I said maybe she should have thought about that before laughing when someone said I should have been aborted. Jackson tried to defend Lily and said I was being unfair. I asked him if he knew his wife had asked me for money and I'd said no. And he looked at her in surprise, so apparently she hadn't mentioned that part. The whole thing devolved into chaos. Blake accused me of thinking I was better than everyone now that I had money. Brianna said I'd always been spiteful and this proved it. Dad said I had an obligation to help family. Mom started crying and saying she didn't raise me to be this heartless. Grandpa Elliot said I was a disgrace. I stood up and told them they'd spent 9 years treating me like I was worthless, and now they were mad that the worthless failure wasn't bailing them out of their problems. I said they'd made their choice about what kind of family we were going to be, and now they had to live with it. I walked out while they were still yelling, got in my car, and drove back to my apartment while my phone exploded with texts and calls. Lily saying I was tearing the family apart, Blake saying I was being vindictive, Dad saying we needed to talk reasonably, Mom saying she was disappointed in me, Brianna saying I was showing my true colors. I put my phone on silent and spent the rest of Sunday watching football and eating takeout. Monday morning, I got a call from Dana. She said Brianna had been crying to her about money problems and family drama, and asked what was really going on. I told her the truth about everything, about the years of mockery and the Thanksgiving conversation and the family meeting where they all expected me to solve their financial problems. She was quiet for a long moment and then said she'd suspected something like that was happening, that the family dynamic had always seemed off to her, but she'd never wanted to get involved. She told me something I hadn't known. Brianna had apparently borrowed money from her 6 months ago and never paid it back, kept making excuses about when she'd have it. Dana said she'd lent her $1,500 and had only gotten $300 back. She said Brianna had told her not to mention it to anyone because she didn't want the family knowing she needed money. Dana said now she was being pressured to lend Brianna more money, and she didn't know what to do. I told Dana she should do whatever felt right to her, but she shouldn't feel obligated to enable Brianna's problems just because they're related. She thanked me for being honest with her and said she was going to tell Brianna no. She also said she'd heard through the family grapevine that Blake had asked several cousins for money and been turned down, that he'd apparently been struggling for months longer than anyone realized. The perfect family facade was cracking, and they were all discovering that nobody had money to spare. Tuesday, Blake showed up at my apartment. I have no idea how he got my address because I'd never given it to any of them, but he was standing in the parking lot when I got home from running errands. He said we needed to talk, and I had to listen to him. I told him he had 5 minutes. He said the family meeting had been a disaster and everyone was fighting now. He said Lily and Jackson were blaming Mom and Dad for not being able to help with their mortgage. He said Brianna was angry at everyone. He said Mom was upset, and Dad was stressed about the property taxes. He said Grandpa Elliot's health was getting worse and he needed expensive medications. He asked me point blank if I was punishing them. I said yes. He asked if I felt good about myself. I said I felt like I was finally being treated with honesty. He said I was being cruel to people who were struggling. I pointed out that I'd been struggling for years and they'd mocked me for it. He said that was different because I was actually doing fine the whole time. I asked him if that made it better or worse that they'd spent years mocking someone who was quietly succeeding while they all pretended to be doing better than they were. He didn't have an answer for that. He just stood there in my parking lot looking defeated. And I realized he'd driven an hour to my apartment because he was that desperate. He asked me one more time if I'd help them. I asked him if he'd apologize for what he said at Thanksgiving. He said he already apologized at the family meeting. I said no, he didn't. He'd minimized it and called it joking around. He said fine, he was sorry. Would that get me to help? I told him an apology that's only given to get something isn't really an apology. He called me self-righteous and left. Wednesday evening, I got a voicemail from Mom. She sounded like she'd been crying. She said the property taxes were due in 2 weeks and they didn't have the money. She said they might lose the house if they couldn't pay. She said she knew I was angry with them, but please, they needed help. They'd raised me and fed me and put a roof over my head, and surely that counted for something. She said Dad had too much pride to beg, but she didn't, so she was begging me to help them keep their home. I haven't called her back. I'm sitting here Thursday night writing this update because I need to think through what comes next. The thing is, part of me does feel something hearing Mom's voicemail, because these are the people who raised me even if they treated me terribly. But the bigger part of me remembers every Thanksgiving and Christmas and birthday where they made me feel worthless. The part of me that spent 3 years planning this remembers why I started planning in the first place. They thought they could treat me like garbage forever, and I'd just accept it because family is family. They're finding out that family goes both ways, and they burned that bridge years ago. But now, I need to decide how far I'm willing to let this go before someone gets seriously hurt by the consequences. Update 2. Alright, so I need to update this because the situation has spiraled in the past week and a half in ways that are honestly kind of wild to watch. To everyone who commented that I should just block them and move on, I hear you, but that's not what this is about. This is about making them face what they did, and watching it happen in real time is validating in a way I can't fully explain. It's been about 10 days since my last update, and the property tax deadline is now 5 days away. I haven't responded to Mom's voicemail, and I've been mostly ignoring the family group chat where everyone is pretending nothing happened while also being super passive-aggressive. Blake posted something about how real family sticks together through hard times. Lily shared some quote about forgiveness. Brianna posted a sad face emoji with no context. It's all very transparent, and I'm not engaging with any of it. Last Friday, I got a text from Dad that was different from his usual stuff. He said he wanted to meet me in person to talk man to man, without the rest of the family involved. He suggested a hardware store, about 30 minutes from my apartment. Said he'd be there Saturday morning around 10 looking at power tools. I was suspicious as hell, but also curious about what angle he was going to try, so I showed up. He was in the tool aisle examining drill bits when I found him. He saw me, and his whole face changed. Got this expression that I think was supposed to be warm and fatherly, but just looked strained. He said he was glad I came and suggested we walk around the store while we talked. So we spent the next 40 minutes wandering through aisles of lumber and paint supplies while he tried to rebuild a relationship we'd never actually had. He started by saying he'd been doing a lot of thinking since the family meeting, and he realized they'd treated me badly over the years. Not that badly, he clarified, but he could see how I might have felt hurt by some of the comments. He said families tease each other, and sometimes it goes too far, and he was sorry if I felt disrespected. I stopped walking and asked if he was apologizing for what they did or for how I felt about it. He got defensive and said there was no difference. I told him there absolutely was a difference, and he knew it. He tried a different approach then. Said that regardless of past issues, we were still family and families help each other. He said I had the means to help and they were in genuine need, and surely I could see that this was an opportunity to be the bigger person. I asked him if being the bigger person meant letting people abuse me for 9 years and then rewarding them for it. He said I was being dramatic and nobody had abused me. I listed off some of the comments from Thanksgiving, the ones I'd memorized because I'd been replaying them in my head for 3 years waiting for this moment. His face went red, and he said that was just talk. People say things they don't mean. I asked him why they'd been saying those things for years if they didn't mean them. He didn't have an answer. Then he told me the real reason he wanted to meet. He said if they couldn't pay the property taxes, they'd have a lien placed on the house, and eventually it could go into foreclosure. He said they'd lived in that house for 35 years, raised their kids there, and losing it would destroy Mom. He said she was having panic attacks about it and barely sleeping. He asked me point blank how I could live with myself knowing I had the power to prevent that and chose not to. I told him I'd lived with a lot worse for a lot longer. I told him I'd spent years listening to them tell me I was worthless and a failure and an embarrassment. And I'd gotten through it by planning for exactly this moment when they'd need me, and I could show them what it felt like to be powerless. He called me vindictive. I said I learned from watching him spend 30 years making me feel small, so he could feel big. He actually flinched at that. He tried to argue with me, said he'd never intentionally made me feel small. He was just trying to motivate me to do better with my life. I asked him if telling Mom to hide my photo from her friends was motivation. He said that wasn't what it was about. I asked him what it was about then. He got quiet and we stood there in the plumbing aisle while other customers walked around us. Finally, he said, I'd always been different from Blake and Lily. I'd never fit the mold of what they expected. And maybe he'd handled that poorly, but it came from wanting me to succeed. That's when I understood something I'd been circling around for 3 years. They hadn't mocked me because I was failing. They'd mocked me because I'd chosen a different path than what they wanted. And my existence as someone who didn't follow their script threatened their whole worldview. Blake was the golden child because he did what they expected, even though he was barely scraping by. Lily was the good daughter because she got married and had kids even though her life was falling apart. I was the failure because I dropped out of college and refused to perform success the way they defined it. I told Dad that I was done performing for them. I said I'd built a good life doing things my way, and I didn't need their approval or their acceptance. He said this wasn't about approval, this was about helping family in crisis. I said they'd had plenty of opportunities to treat me like family, and they'd chosen to treat me like a mistake instead. Then, I left him standing there and drove home. Sunday, Lily showed up at my apartment. I'm still trying to figure out how they're all getting my address when I've never given it to them, but apparently Blake told her after he'd come by last week. She brought her kids, which I'm pretty sure was a strategic choice to make me feel bad. They were running around the parking lot while she knocked on my door and asked if we could talk. I let her in, but told her the kids had to stay outside because I wasn't doing the whole use your children as emotional leverage thing. She got offended and said she just brought them because Jackson was at work and she couldn't leave them home alone. I said fine. but they weren't coming inside. She called them back to the car and told them to play their tablets for a few minutes, then came inside. She looked around my apartment and I could see her taking it all in. The nice furniture and the good TV and the setup I had for my home office. She made some comment about how I'd done well for myself. I said I had. She said she wished she'd known I was doing so well. Maybe they could have talked about things differently. I asked her what would have been different if she'd known. She didn't answer that. She sat down on my couch and started crying, which I was expecting. She said things were really bad with Jackson. He'd been picking up extra hours doing delivery driving in addition to his insurance job, and he was exhausted all the time and short-tempered with her and the kids. They were now 3 months behind on the mortgage and the bank had started foreclosure proceedings. She said they had 60 days to come up with the missing payments plus fees, which totaled about $8,500, or they'd lose the house. She asked if I would lend it to them. She said she'd pay me back as soon as Jackson's hours got restored at his main job. She promised? I asked when that would be and she said probably in the next few months. I asked if she had that in writing from his employer. She said no, but he'd talk to his boss about it. I said that wasn't a guarantee. She got frustrated and said I was being difficult on purpose. I told her I was being realistic and she wasn't used to people expecting her to have actual plans instead of just hoping things worked out. She asked why I was being so cruel to her. She said she'd apologized at the family meeting and she'd tried to make things right and I was just punishing her for sport now. I asked her what exactly she'd apologized for. She said for the comments at Thanksgiving. I asked her to repeat what she'd said specifically at Thanksgiving. She got uncomfortable and said she didn't remember exactly, but she knew it was mean. I told her she'd laughed when someone said the turkey had more value than me, and she'd giggled when they suggested making me wash dishes for minimum wage practice. She started crying harder and said she'd been drinking that day, and she'd just been going along with everyone else and she didn't really think those things. I asked her if that made it better, that she'd spent years going along with everyone else mocking me because she didn't have the spine to stand up for me. She said that wasn't fair. I said nothing about this situation was fair, and she was finally experiencing what that felt like. She left crying, and her kids asked her what was wrong when she got to the car. I watched from my window as she tried to pull herself together before driving away. Monday morning, I got added to a group text with a bunch of extended family members I barely know, cousins and aunts and uncles, people I see maybe once every few years at big family events. Someone had clearly told them what was going on because the messages were all about family loyalty and sticking together and how shameful it was that anyone would abandon family in need. Nobody used my name, but it was pretty obvious who they were talking about. I left the group text without responding. 10 minutes later, I got individual texts from 3 different people. Dana texted saying she was sorry they dragged her into it and she hadn't told anyone anything. An uncle I barely remembered named Elliot texted saying I should be ashamed of myself for not helping my parents. A cousin asked if the rumors were true that I was refusing to help the family. I ignored all of them. Tuesday, Blake called me from a number I didn't recognize. When I answered, he said his phone had been shut off because he couldn't pay the bill, and he was calling from a coworker's phone. He said he'd been fired from the dealership because his sales numbers had been too low for too long. He said he was going to lose his car because he was behind on payments, and he needed transportation to job hunt. He asked if I would at least help him keep his car. Said it was only $1,200 to get current on the loan. I asked him if he remembered calling me a charity case. He said he'd apologized for that. I said he'd done no such thing. He'd minimized it and called it joking around and then demanded money. He said fine, he was genuinely sorry. He'd been an ass. He'd treated me terribly for years. Was that what I wanted to hear? I asked him if he'd be saying any of that if he didn't need money. He got quiet. Then he said probably not. I told him at least he was being honest now and hung up. Wednesday evening, Brianna showed up at my apartment. She'd apparently gotten the address from Lily. She didn't ask to come inside, just stood in my doorway and handed me an envelope. Inside was a handwritten letter that was like 6 pages long, detailing every nice thing she'd ever done for me as a kid, and how she'd always loved me like a nephew, and how hurt she was that I'd turned my back on the family. The letter kept emphasizing that she'd helped babysit me when I was young, and had taken me to the park and bought me birthday presents, and didn't that count for something? I read the letter while she stood there waiting. When I finished, I handed it back to her. She looked confused. I told her that making a list of basic family obligations and decent human behavior didn't earn her a reward 20 years later. I said babysitting me a few times in the 90s didn't give her the right to call me a failure in 2024. She said I was being ungrateful and petty. I asked her if she'd paid Dana back the $1,500 she owed her. Her face went pale. She asked how I knew about that. I said Dana and I actually talked like normal people instead of just performing family obligations. Brianna got defensive and said that was a private matter between her and Dana, and none of my business. I said but my money was somehow everyone's business. She didn't have a response to that. She took her letter back and left without saying anything else. Thursday, Mom called me crying. She said Dad had told her about their conversation at the hardware store and she couldn't believe I'd said such hurtful things to him. She said Dad had spent the past few days barely speaking and sitting in his chair staring at nothing, and she'd never seen him like that. She said I'd broken something in him with my words, and she wanted to know if I was happy now. I told her I wasn't happy, I was angry. And I'd been angry for 9 years while they all told me my feelings didn't matter. She said my feelings did matter, but so did theirs. And right now they were facing losing their home, and I had the power to stop it, and I was choosing not to. She said the deadline was tomorrow, and they had no way to pay. She said they'd tried to get a loan, but couldn't qualify with their credit. She said they'd asked everyone they knew, and nobody had that kind of money to lend. She said I was their last hope, and she was begging me as my mother to please help them. I asked her if she'd been begging when she told people she kept my photo hidden because I was too embarrassing to explain. She went silent. Then she said she'd never said that. I told her I'd heard her say it at Thanksgiving. She said I must have misheard or misunderstood. I asked her if she was calling me a liar. She said she'd never say something like that about her own son. I told her she'd said worse than that, and we both knew it. She started crying again and said I was rewriting history to justify my cruelty. She said she'd always loved me even when I made choices she didn't agree with. I asked her why love looked like mockery and contempt for 9 years. She said I was exaggerating and being overdramatic. I told her the property tax office closed at 5 p.m. tomorrow, and she should probably figure out a plan that didn't involve me. Then I hung up. I'm writing this Thursday night, and tomorrow is Friday, the deadline for the property taxes. I know what's going to happen tomorrow. They're going to miss the deadline because they don't have the money, and I'm not giving it to them. A lien will be placed on their house, and they'll have time to pay it off before foreclosure, but it's going to hang over them like a threat. Lily and Jackson are going to lose their house in about 45 days if they don't come up with the money. Blake is going to lose his car probably next week. Brianna is going to get evicted from her apartment. And I'm going to sit here in my comfortable apartment with my good job and my savings account and watch it all happen. Because they spent 9 years teaching me that family doesn't actually mean anything when it comes down to it. They're finding out I'm a quick learner. Final update. I need to write this while it's still fresh because what just happened in the past 12 hours has been absolutely insane. And I'm running on adrenaline and rage and this weird sense of vindication that feels both satisfying and hollow at the same time. If you've been following this whole thing, you know where we were at. Friday was the property tax deadline, and I was going to let them miss it. That was the plan. Friday morning, I woke up to 17 missed calls and about 40 text messages. I made coffee and read through them while sitting on my couch. Mom and Dad both texted saying they had one last chance to pay before 5 p.m. and begging me to reconsider. Blake texted that his car was being repossessed that afternoon and he had no way to get to job interviews. Lily sent photos of her kids and said they were going to be homeless in 6 weeks. Brianna sent another long message about family bonds and loyalty. Even Grandpa Elliot texted, which was shocking because I didn't think he knew how to text, saying I was making a mistake I'd regret forever. I didn't respond to any of them. I went to the gym, came home, did some work projects, ordered lunch delivery. Around 3 p.m., my phone started ringing nonstop. I put it on silent and watched a movie. At 6 p.m., I checked and saw that Mom had left 4 voicemails. I listened to them. The first 3 were her crying and begging. The fourth one, left at 5:30, was just her saying they'd missed the deadline and it was done, and she hoped I could live with what I'd done. I felt good about it. I know that sounds cold, but I'd spent 3 years getting to this point, and watching it actually happen was this rush of vindication. They'd finally faced a real consequence for treating me like nothing for 9 years. The lien was placed on their house, and they'd have to deal with it. I ordered dinner and watched another movie and went to bed around 11, feeling like the revenge arc was complete. Then at 3 a.m., my phone started ringing again. I ignored it at first, but it kept ringing. Different numbers over and over. I finally looked and saw I had missed calls from Dana, from Blake's wife, who I'd only met twice, from numbers I didn't recognize. Then someone started pounding on my door. Actual pounding, like they were trying to break it down. I got up and looked through the peephole and saw Blake standing there, and behind him, I could see multiple cars in the parking lot. I opened the door and he looked terrible, like he'd been crying or hadn't slept in days. He said I needed to come with them right now. I asked him what the hell he was talking about. He said Grandpa Elliot had collapsed at their parents' house and was in the hospital, and it was bad, and the whole family was there and they needed me there too. I told him to slow down and explain what happened. He said Grandpa had been at Mom and Dad's house because he'd been staying with them since he couldn't afford his own place anymore. They'd been arguing about the property tax situation and blaming each other for the mess, and Grandpa had gotten agitated and his blood pressure had spiked and he'd collapsed. The ambulance had taken him to the emergency room and they'd been there for hours and the doctors were saying it was a stroke and they didn't know if he'd make it through the night. I asked why they needed me there. Blake said because I was family, and families show up when things get serious. I asked him if families show up for people they've mocked and degraded for years. He grabbed my arm and said this wasn't the time for my revenge games. This was about Grandpa potentially dying. I pulled my arm away and told him I'd get dressed and follow them in my own car. The drive to the hospital was about 40 minutes, and I spent the whole time trying to process what was happening. Part of me was wondering if this was some kind of manipulation tactic, if they'd staged something this dramatic just to guilt me into helping them. But Blake had looked genuinely panicked, and I knew they wouldn't involve the hospital in a scheme. When I got there and found them in the waiting area, I could see this was real. Mom and Dad were sitting together, both looking like they'd aged 10 years in a week. Lily was pacing with her phone, probably trying to keep Jackson updated since he was home with the kids. Brianna was sitting alone in a corner looking exhausted. Blake's wife was there trying to comfort Mom. Dana was there too, which surprised me until I remembered Brianna was her mother. Everyone looked up when I walked in, and there was this moment of silence like nobody knew how to react to me being there. Dad stood up and walked over to me. He said Grandpa was in surgery. They'd found bleeding in his brain from the stroke, and they were trying to relieve the pressure. He said the next few hours were critical, and they wouldn't know anything until the surgery was done. I asked what caused the stroke. Dad said the doctors mentioned his blood pressure had been dangerously high and stress was a factor. Then he looked at me and said they'd been arguing about me when it happened. That hit different than I expected. I asked him what exactly they'd been arguing about. Dad said Grandpa had been saying I was a disgrace for abandoning the family, and Mom had been defending my right to be angry, and they'd been going back and forth for over an hour, getting more and more heated. Dad said Grandpa had been yelling about how he'd fought in a war and worked his whole life, and now his own grandson was letting the family fall apart. And then he'd grabbed his head and fallen. Mom stood up and walked over to where Dad and I were standing. She said she needed to talk to me alone. We went down the hallway to a quiet area near the vending machines. She said she'd been thinking about everything I'd said over the past few weeks, and she understood now why I was so angry. She said she'd convinced herself over the years that the teasing and the comments were normal family dynamics, but hearing me repeat them back word for word had made her realize how cruel they'd actually been. I asked her why it took Grandpa having a stroke for her to realize that. She said she'd been in denial because facing it meant admitting she'd been a bad mother to me, and that was hard to accept. She said she'd spent the past week crying and barely sleeping and replaying every family dinner and holiday in her mind and seeing all the moments where she'd failed me. She asked if we could talk about this honestly without the anger and the games. I told her this wasn't a game. I said I'd spent 3 years watching and planning and waiting for them to need me so I could show them what it felt like to be powerless and dismissed. She asked me if I'd gotten what I wanted now. I said I didn't know. She asked me if watching our family destroy itself was making me happy. I said it wasn't about happiness, it was about justice. She told me that Grandpa might die tonight, and if he did, his last hours would have been spent arguing about me and whether I was a good person or a selfish one. She said I had a choice right now about what kind of person I wanted to be going forward. I asked her why she thought she could manipulate me with guilt after years of treating me like garbage. She said she wasn't trying to manipulate me. She was trying to be honest with me for maybe the first time in years. We went back to the waiting area, and Lily came over immediately. She said they needed to talk to me about something important. Blake joined us, and Dad stood up too. The four of them stood there looking at me, and I could see they'd planned this, worked out what they were going to say. Blake started by saying they knew they'd treated me terribly and they were sorry for all of it. Not just sorry because they needed money, but genuinely sorry for years of making me feel worthless. Lily said she'd been going through her own stuff with her marriage and her life not turning out how she'd planned, and taking it out on me had been easier than facing her own failures. Dad said he'd always had this specific idea of what success looked like, and when I didn't fit that mold, it had threatened his whole worldview, so he'd tried to diminish me instead of examining his own narrow thinking. Mom said she'd failed as a mother by not protecting me from the family dynamic and by participating in it herself. I stood there listening to them and waiting for the other shoe to drop, for the part where they asked for money. But they just stood there after apologizing, waiting for me to respond. So I asked them directly if this was leading to them asking me to pay for everything. Blake said no. He said they weren't asking for money right now. They were asking if there was any way to fix what they'd broken between us as a family. I told them I didn't know if it could be fixed. I said they'd spent 9 years building a family dynamic where I was the designated failure, and they were all successful. And now that the truth was out, and they were all struggling, they wanted to suddenly change the rules. I said that felt convenient. Lily said it wasn't convenient, it was necessary because They were watching their family implode in real time. And money aside, they were losing each other. That's when Brianna stood up from where she'd been sitting silently and joined the conversation. She said she needed to say something even though nobody wanted to hear it. She said the family had always been built on this foundation of competition and comparison, and everyone trying to prove they were doing better than everyone else. She said Dad had set that tone growing up by constantly comparing them to other families and other people's accomplishments. She said it had poisoned all of them and made them incapable of genuine connection. Dad tried to argue with her, but she talked over him. She said he'd spent 35 years making everyone feel like they had to earn his approval by meeting his arbitrary standards of success. And when I'd refused to play that game, I'd become the target for everyone else's frustrations. She said she'd participated in it because she'd been doing it to her own daughter Dana for years, until Dana had finally told her to stop. She said Dana had been the one to point out that our whole family was toxic and broken, and nobody could admit it. Dana nodded from where she was sitting and said she'd been watching our family dysfunction her whole life, and it had made her decide she never wanted kids because she didn't want to pass on those patterns. She said watching me refuse to give them money had actually made her respect me because I'd finally set a boundary that nobody else in the family had ever been willing to set. The surgeon came out around 5 a.m. and said Grandpa had made it through surgery, but the next 24 hours would be critical. He said the stroke had been severe, and even if he survived, there would likely be permanent damage and a long recovery. He said family could see him one at a time for a few minutes, once he was settled in recovery. We all sat there processing that information, and then Blake's phone started ringing. He answered it, and his face went white. He hung up and said the car dealership had just notified him that they'd repossessed his car from their driveway, and he had no way to get home. His wife started crying. Lily got a notification on her phone and said the bank had just sent her a formal notice that foreclosure proceedings would begin in 30 days. Mom said the lien on their house was going to cost them almost $6,000 in penalties and fees if they couldn't pay it within 90 days. Everything was hitting at once, and they all just sat there in this hospital waiting room at 5 in the morning, realizing that their lives were falling apart simultaneously. I watched them and felt this weird mix of satisfaction and something else I couldn't identify. The revenge was complete. They were facing real consequences. They'd apologized and admitted what they'd done. This was everything I'd planned for 3 years, but Grandpa was in recovery from a stroke that might kill him or leave him permanently disabled, and stress from arguing about me had been a contributing factor. Blake didn't have a car and no job and no way to dig out of his situation. Lily was going to lose her house, and her kids were going to have to change schools and live somewhere cheaper. Mom and Dad were going to lose their home of 35 years eventually. Brianna was going to get evicted. The whole family structure was collapsing. I sat down and looked at all of them and asked what they wanted from me right now. Specifically, Mom said they wanted to know if there was any way to start over and rebuild something healthier. Dad said they wanted to know if I could forgive them eventually, even if not right now. Blake said he wanted to know if I felt like the revenge had been worth it. Lily said she wanted to know if I still considered them family despite everything. I told them I didn't know the answers to any of those questions yet. I said I'd spent 3 years angry and planning, and now that the moment was here, I didn't feel as good about it as I thought I would. I said watching them suffer wasn't giving me the satisfaction I'd expected because it turned out I wasn't as heartless as I'd tried to convince myself I was. But I also said that didn't mean I was ready to fix everything and make it all okay just because they'd apologized one time. The nurse came and said Grandpa was awake and asking for family. We took turns going back to see him. When it was my turn, I walked into the recovery room and saw him lying there with tubes and monitors everywhere. He looked small and old, and nothing like the stern grandfather who'd told me I should have been aborted. He saw me and tried to talk but couldn't form the words properly because of the stroke. His face was drooping on one side and his right hand wasn't working. I stood there next to his bed and he tried to reach for me with his left hand. I took it and he squeezed weakly. He managed to get out the word sorry, but it was slurred and took him several tries. I told him to rest and not try to talk. He kept trying anyway, kept squeezing my hand and looking at me with these desperate eyes like he was trying to communicate something important before he might die. The nurse came in and said I needed to let him rest. I went back to the waiting room and everyone looked at me for information. I told them he'd tried to apologize but couldn't really speak. Mom started crying again. Dad asked if I thought Grandpa understood what was happening. I said I thought he understood he might die and he wanted to make peace before he did. We stayed at the hospital through the morning. Around 9 a.m., I told them I was going home to shower and get some rest and I'd come back later. Blake asked if we could talk before I left. We went outside to the parking lot and stood by my car. He said he knew I didn't owe them anything, but he wanted to know if there was any possible way I might consider helping them. Not as charity, but maybe as a loan, with a real payment plan and interest and everything legally documented. I asked him why I would do that. He said because despite everything, we were still family, and somewhere under all the dysfunction and toxicity, there had to be something worth saving. He said he'd been thinking about what Brianna said about how Dad had poisoned them all with competition and comparison, and he realized he didn't actually care about being the golden child anymore. He said he just wanted to figure out how to be a better person and a better brother, and whether that was possible at this point. I told him I'd think about it. He said that was more than he deserved and he'd take it. I drove home and crashed for a few hours. When I woke up, it was early afternoon, and I had messages from Dana asking how I was doing. We texted back and forth, and she said the family was still at the hospital and Grandpa was stable but not improving. She said everyone was exhausted and arguing less because they were too tired to keep up the fighting. She asked me what I was going to do. I told her I honestly didn't know. She said she'd understand whatever I decided, but she hoped I wouldn't completely walk away because she thought there might be something salvageable if everyone was willing to actually change. She said she'd seen glimpses of the family being vulnerable and honest with each other over the past 12 hours, and it was the first time she'd ever seen that happen. I've been sitting here for the past hour trying to figure out what comes next. The revenge worked. They're all suffering consequences for treating me terribly. They've apologized and admitted what they did. They're facing financial ruin and family collapse. Grandpa might die. Everything I planned happened exactly how I wanted it to. But now, I have to decide if I'm the kind of person who watches them all lose everything, or if I'm willing to help them rebuild on different terms. If I help, it can't be about going back to how things were. It would have to be about building something completely different where I'm not the designated failure and they're not pretending to be more successful than they are. It would have to involve real change and real accountability, or I could walk away and let them face the consequences they've earned. Let the house get liens and foreclosures and repossessions. Let them figure out their own mess while I go back to my comfortable life and never deal with their dysfunction again. That would be the clean revenge ending where I win and they lose. I'm writing this because I need to process what I'm feeling right now, which is way more complicated than I expected. Revenge was supposed to feel satisfying and final, but instead it feels messy and incomplete and like there are no good options from here. They did terrible things to me for years, and they're facing consequences for it, but watching an old man have a stroke and a family implode isn't giving me the sense of justice I thought it would. Some of you are going to say I should help them because family is important. Some of you are going to say I should walk away because they don't deserve my help. I know both of those positions and I understand both arguments, but I'm the one who has to live with whatever decision I make from here, and I don't know yet which version of myself I want to be. The one who burns it all down, or the one who tries to build something better from the ashes. That's where I am right now. 3 years of planning and 3 weeks of execution, and it all led to this moment at 3 in the morning where they showed up desperate and broken, and I had all the power, just like I wanted, and now I'm not sure what to do with it.